Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vadim, and today I would like to talk to you and about the project Harbor. How is the project set up? But before we dive in, mostly of you maybe already know what it is, but Harbor is an open source container registry. So if you're using containers, you seen a container registry, and Harbor is an open source version of a container registry that is part of the CNCF, the Cloud Native Foundation. And I'm going to talk about Harbor, and I'm going to talk about the CNCF project, and then I'm going to show you a few things that you can do with a container registry that is a bit more than just a dump bucket where you can push and pull artifacts. So this is the agenda for today. I'm going to present myself and who I am and why I'm kind of part of the open source community and my open source journey. I'm going to talk about a bit about the CNCF community and the project Harbor within the CNCF community, how it's structured, how other projects are structured. So you have a bit of an overview, how the CNCF as a whole is working. I'm going to give you a short introduction to Harbor, what it is, but I'm not going to dive too deep into the topic because in general, container registries are kind of boring because it's, more or less an artifact. So it's, after writing documentation, this is the second most boring part. But there are interesting use cases, and I would like to highlight them and talk about those use cases and see that you can, take something from out of it. And then, as a last point, I would like to, have an unpopular opinion or unusual opinion, and I would like to have open up a discussion with you and see how far we can get at the bar there. And I basically say that, most likely you don't need an artifact repository at all. And let's see how far we can get with this argument. So we have some time for questions answered then and discuss this topic. So about myself, my name is Vadim Bauer. I'm in the software industry for more than 20 years. My first computer was a 386 SX33. I still remember it. It looked pretty much like this one. I'm an ex-Siemens employee. I've worked here in Zug for Siemens for I think 3 or 4 years. I've been working there in the area of cloud enablement, cloud transformation, and I've been, helping Siemens projects, move into the cloud. I've been working on, I think, where are we? Yeah, I don't know where the slide is. I've been working on, for example, Siemens ID. You might know it. So I, with a few other people, we did an initial evaluation and made the decision to move with Auth0 instead of Salesforce. So I'm really glad still today that we convinced a few people to not go with Salesforce as their identity and access management, but with Auth0. And so this is my role was my role at Siemens. I mean, one of many. And now my current focus is basically cloud and SaaS still. So I'm working I'm partner at a company called 56K Cloud, and where we enable companies and users to move into the cloud and AWS. We enable them to move workloads into the cloud and manage the cloud, and also transition into kind of SaaS business model and transition software into the SaaS. So taking care about those aspects like what makes a SaaS. And yeah, so this is my current focus. About me privately or hobbies. So I try to do a bit sport in the winter. I'm snowboard. I'm doing a lot of snowboarding and sports in general. I'm in my free time, hobby time. I'm kind of interested in the aspects of professionalization and of IT. So I'm part of the software crafters here in Switzerland. You can go to the websites called Socrates CH. It's a Socrates event in the Alps over a couple of days where we meet from a lot of people from Switzerland and also international, and discuss about professionalization in the IT. There is also a one-day event. It's called Socrates Day, which is basically a one-day event around this topic, which is I highly recommend those two events to everyone, because it's builds a community here in Switzerland, and you get to know very interesting and knowledgeable people. Open source and me. Before I prepared this talk, I've been kind of reflecting on my involvement into open source, and for me it was always kind of a no-brainer, or normal to be kind of a using open source and actually also living from open source. But in retrospect, it's not common, and I would say that open source software plays a big or important role in my life. So I'm of course a user of open source software. I'm also a maintainer of open source software. So there's like kind of a small, tiny libraries, partly open source software that I maintain. And I'm also a founder of open source software. So I created like 7-8 years ago an open source library, which is called Koenig. Is a e-invoicing library that is luckily used by many 100,000 companies in Europe, in Germany, and Switzerland as well. So if your company is writing or receiving invoices with Datev or Abacus, it's likely they're using software that I've written. I earn my money or my salary mostly with open source software as a consultant and as a user of open source software, or as a instructor and a teacher, and basically everything around open source software. And for me, it was always natural, so that's why it's. I think I never thought about it until I prepared this slide today. So why I'm here talking about the project Harbor, because I'm a contributor to the project. So we run and operate multiple Harbor-based container registries. We run them for customers. We run them on-prem as a SaaS. We provide consulting and commercial support for Harbor. And we build container management solutions on top of Harbor, or integrate container management solutions into organizations. And because Siemens is using Harbor and in the project, in one of their public offering, it's MindSphere. Yeah, exactly. So Siemens is using Harbor as part of MindSphere, offering Harbor to their customers, and also hosting it for customers. And last point is that, of course, I've been invited by Roger to join it. So this is basically our offering. It's called a kind of a dedicated container registry based on Harbor. And the knowledge we get there, we feed back into the Harbor and make Harbor a better solution. Thanks for Roger for inviting me to talk about Harbor. Let's jump into the second topic. It's about the Cloud Native Foundation. I think every one of you know about the Cloud Native Foundation and what it is. So the most famous project of the Cloud Native Foundation is Kubernetes. And when you see this map, so there's like a huge map of Cloud Native projects and Cloud Native software, and somewhere in the middle is Harbor. But if you take a bit of a closer look, there is a kind of not all projects are created equal. So here you see the full landscape, which contains also the software stacks or software solutions of Cloud Native Foundation members that are not necessarily part of Cloud Native itself. And if we take a look at projects that are graduated, incubating, or in a sandbox state, it boils down to about 40, 50 projects. And you see that one of those projects is Kubernetes. There is etcd, Core DNS, and Harbor, which was, I think, project number 4, and that graduated from CNCF. So you get a bit of a different picture. And when we take a look at at Kubernetes as a whole, and we take a look who is basically contributing to Kubernetes and apply the same patterns to other projects because they're quite similar, we see that here in this graph, we see the contributions over time. And when the project Kubernetes started, it was mainly maintained and kind of driven forward by Google. And then Red Hat joined, and then other companies joined. And you see that over time, since Kubernetes joined CNCF, you see that the involvement of the big companies decreased, and the contributions from others, which is individuals and also smaller companies, increased. So that as of today, Google and maybe as well Red Hat are not playing a major role there. So it is evenly distributed, the workload and also the control over the project. And this is partly true for other CNCF projects, but not necessarily. I'll talk on that topic briefly. So this is the kind of a list of committers and contributors to Kubernetes only, but I think we can apply it a bit in a smaller scale also to other CNCF projects. We see that, of course, Google, Red Hat, and independent contributors are in the top 3. And we see that on the left side are the committers who are committing code to Kubernetes, and on the right side you see the contributors to the repositories. This means like a code contribution and also documentation and also opening tickets, and those things are considered to be contributors. And there we have, of course, a lot of independent, which are users basically. That, for example, open tickets, changing some documentations, and we see that even though the project is mature and evolved, we see still that the big companies like Google, Red Hat, VMware, Microsoft, IBM are still kind of dominating and Kubernetes, and also kind of leading the way for Kubernetes. So the lists, I just looked at the list, and so we are about 300 contributors there and committers with over 5 people. So this means that those, I would say that the companies in the top 50 maybe even have full-time employees working on Kubernetes or contributing to Kubernetes. So there is a lot of companies who have full-time employees who are contributing to Kubernetes, and this same applies also on a smaller scale, but the same applies to other projects, just like Project Harbor. And so my observation in general in the open source space and the community is that there are typically 2 types of contributors. So one is type of contributors are the ones who are giving direction and steering the project, and there are mostly the founder of the project or the company that founded the project dominating. And we have mostly full-time employees there who are solely working on this open source project, and there is a large stakeholder behind that is funding the project. And of course, in this way, they can dictate and steer the direction of the project and where the project is heading. And on the other side, we have a smaller group, or maybe a bigger group, but with a small, with not such a big voice, that are providing improvements to the projects, like fixing bugs, things that don't work for you. You just open up and fix the problem. You do small improvements, like improving the documentation, asking questions, answering questions, and so forth. And these are mostly small organizations or individual contributors. And the same thing applies basically to especially for the smaller projects, because the smaller projects are mostly dominated by one company, and they provide actually the full-time employee. And this is actually the same situation for Harbor. So we have at Harbor, we have VMware as the main sponsor and contributor to Harbor, because VMware ships Harbor with their software stack with VMware, and they're interested in having a container registry on the edge with their software stack. So they provide Harbor as an option to install within VMware. And currently, there are 16 people working full time on the project Harbor. So it's not such a small team. Of course, there are different contributors like myself, but there are 16 full time developers or projects and managers and leads who are kind of steering the project. The Project Harbor was one of the fourth project, I think the fourth project that graduated from the Cloud Native Foundation. So the first one was Kubernetes, the second one was Core DNS or something, or etcd, and then comes already Project Harbor. So it's a very mature and a project that exists for quite a few years in the CNCF space. There are at the moment like 255 contributors over the five years. So maybe like 50, 60 are from VMware, and the rest are individual contributors or small organizations. And right now there are more and more companies jumping on the Harbor ship, which is like SUSE, for example, and OVH is a contributor to the project. So there are now more and more, kind of bigger companies joining and helping out VMware, which is a good sign, because it's, it should not be, in my opinion, should not be just dominated by one company. Although VMware is doing a great job here, so I'm not blaming them, but it's always better to have the load on multiple shoulders. So my conclusion is that the majority of CNCF projects are well funded. So they can afford to have dozens of full-time employees dedicated to this open source project. So there is they're well funded. And the other observation is that many CNCF projects have one main contributor. So basically, like Harbor, a lot of other projects have one main contributor that is kind of steering the direction, and the others are following and providing contributions, but they're not, I would say, not always deeply involved into the direction of the project. And the last point that I would like to mention, especially in regards of CNCF and how the CNCF is structured and set up, is that maintaining and contributing to open source software is not a hobby. So it is not something that, like I would say in the early days when Linus started with Linux just for fun, we're past beyond this point. We're in an area where open source is a main business driver. A lot of companies rely on open source software and also rely on open source as a business model. Although people say open source is not a business model, but it is some sort of a business model, because if you go open source with your main project, you cannot go back. And it is important, and we should, as a developer community and also as a society, not kind of part away from this idealistic neckbeard developer point of view on open source software, that people just doing it for fun and for hobby. Of course, there are projects that are fun and people do it because they really like it, but there is the implication that they wouldn't probably do it if there was no benefit for themselves or for others. So it's not a hobby like maybe like painting. It is a serious business, and we should, as a society and as a community of developers, move away from this viewpoint and transfer or get across the message to everyone else that open source is not kind of something unserious. No, it's, I mean, open source or open source software is maybe even more present and more dominant than commercial software nowadays. Yeah, so this is my viewpoint on a bit of an open source software and how the CNCF project is structured. But let's dive into the into Project Harbor. And as I said, Harbor basically is an open source container registry, and there is nothing special about. I mean, there are a few things that are special, and I would like to highlight them. But in general, a container registry is a place where you push images and pull images, and people usually don't care and don't they just need a place where they can push and pull images, and they're fine, and everything is happy. But this is not what I would like to focus on today, because I mean, although it becomes a bit boring if we just talk about all the features and on also the details about what Harbor could provide, which are essentially 80% the same as ECR or Docker Hub and whatever. But let's keep it brief. So Harbor is based off of multiple components, and those components are open source projects by themselves. For example, Harbor is a wrapper around the Docker registry, which is this open source project. So it wraps the Docker registry, provides a UI over it. It provides a REST API over the registry, with user management and project management, and it has also the functionality of a chart, so you can upload your Helm charts there. It has a UI. It has plugins for vulnerability scanners, different types of vulnerability scanners. You can plug in a notary, and everything you can see in a nice dashboard and have an overview about what is in your container registry. And this is basically how a container registry looks like. It's a simple registry where you have your project, and each project can have multiple containers. You can set up things like permissions. You have kind of these robot accounts where you can integrate into your CI/CD system. You can have webhooks, notifications. You have logs. You can configure a lot of things. So a lot of functionality are, I would say, 80% of this functionality is also existing in other projects. So what makes so why should you use Harbor over X? So why should you use Harbor over Docker Hub or over ECR or ACR or whatever the name is? And the reason is, if you're happy with the solution you have, you shouldn't change it, because as I said, like for 80% of the users, their default setup is probably good enough. So container registries are a commodity service today. So because every cloud provider has a container registry, every SCM like GitHub, GitLab has a container registry, and Hub or Docker Hub is for free if you have if you want to make your containers public, and if you want to have them private, it's a very low price. It's like $5 a month or something, So for small teams and organization, there is no really need to move to something dedicated or something on their own. And if people are happy, they should definitely not switch. But for the other 20%, it's hard to find another solution, because there's basically like 2 other solutions on the market. I mean, we're talking about 2 other solutions that are really specific for containers. There are, of course, other solutions like the classical artifact repository, like Sonatype, JFrog, and what else do we have? I don't know. So there are, of course, those classical artifact repositories that also can store containers, but I'm just looking at container-specific registries. We basically have just 2, that are similar, like K on one hand and Harbor on the other hand, and then everything else. So Harbor really shines when you have, you're reaching the point where the default is not good enough for you, and this is especially the case if you go full on containerized workflows. If you have really deep containerized workflows, if you really work a lot with containers, and you have maybe even multi-cloud rollouts, so you have different cloud providers, and you want to kind of ship and move containers around. if you want to get on board customers, partners, and other entities, things will become more and more difficult with the traditional registries that provided by the cloud providers, because it's really difficult to get the permissions right there and giving them access. So things become more and more complicated, and this is actually the point where customers and organizations move away from their typical container registry, something towards Harbor. And normally, especially in larger organizations, what I see is that we don't have any more one registry. So most companies, especially the bigger ones, they have multiple container registries, and they have a registry on AWS, they have one on Azure, and because of the deep integration of those registries into the cloud providers, companies don't want to switch to one. So the trend is basically to replicate images across multiple registries, and this is something where Harbor shines. This, what in my opinion makes Harbor special compared to other registries, and I've summarized a bit of a few points that I think that make Harbor special. So one thing is that, of course, you can self-host it yourself. You can roll out on-prem. You have really wide degree of freedom there, how you want to deploy it. So you can deploy it in Kubernetes, you can deploy it in Docker, and you can even deploy it as a native binary, which is what VMware does, for example. So they deploy it just as a native software stack. You have a really nice possibilities to have a role-based access and control. So you can really fine-grain control who is accessing or who can access what images and what projects, and you can control it quite nicely, and also integrate your identity and access management of your organization into Harbor and have everything nicely integrated. You have like one of the things that other registries don't have, basically, is this policy-based replications. And the policy-based replication is you can replicate your images to different other registries. And especially today, because when Docker Hub announced their new tier and pricing policy, and also the limitations on the pull and push limits, many people immediately started to move away from Harbor and to ACR, to ECR, and all other registries. And what we now have, we have like a really huge ecosystem of different registries, and we have images everywhere, especially in big organizations. They have images everywhere, and with Harbor it's possible to bring them all together or replicate images and have one central place where images can reside and still be replicated to other registries, so that everything is in sync. On top of that, you have things like vulnerability scanners, but of course others provided as well. You have this additional security layer I'm going to talk about as a separate point, because I think this is something very interesting. You have things like a really elaborated, or not elaborated, but handy retention policy functionality, so you can define when should be images deleted and removed. So when images are not accessed for, let's say, half a year or something, they can be removed, but keep the last 10. Or so you can really grainly control what you want to retain and what you want to delete, which is very powerful, especially if you have a lot of images, and this can grow quite fast into terabyte and petabyte area. You have a graphical user interface. This is also not something common to other container registries, especially the ones with the cloud providers, because there you have like the console, and you need to have access to the cloud provider in order to get access to the registry. And last but not least is the possibility to have a RESTful API. This is also something that is not very common, although in K and now Docker Hub is planning to release an API. This is something that is normally not, or was not common until today, but there are really a lot of use cases where a RESTful API is a very needed functionality, and I'll also show a few use cases there. Yeah, so let's move on to this to the topic about like container registries that can do more. I've been talking about why Harbor is special, and I would like to present you a few use cases that I think are mostly or only possible with Harbor because um, yeah, they're not possible with other container registries, or yeah, so that's why I would like to highlight a few use cases and show you what's basically possible and how you could benefit and use it as well if you know come to the point where you need to move beyond what is provided by your cloud provider or your organization. So the typical enterprise use cases for Harbor, in my opinion, are this image distribution. So they have like a really different types of image distribution. So you can just push and pull images, but there are also even like point peer-to-peer image distributions with, for example, the Project Kraken or Project Dragonfly. You can really distribute container images to in a peer-to-peer fashion over multiple global locations, and this allows you to distribute a lot of images very quickly around the globe with making your application accessible immediately or making changes accessible of your application accessible immediately. So this is something for organizations that have applications roll out globally. And you can use, for example, or people using Harbor to ship images to restricted regions. So if you have a region, without like a government cloud or a China region or some restricted regions where you cannot get data from other regions, people set up their own registry there in this region and then do a replication over VPN, for example, and make their container images accessible in this region. And the other point is data residency. So there are a lot of organizations that require to have data reside in a region. So like China is a good example there, but there's also in the US there are example like medical data, medical software. Sometimes it's required to have data close to or data in a region. And the other use case for enterprises and basically IAM systems. So if you want to integrate the registry with your IAM system, and you don't want to expose or you don't want to go the route over your cloud provider, or when the cloud provider is when it's not possible with the cloud provider, Harbor is a good solution there because it supports multiple IAM systems. And the last point is, of course, multi-cloud rollout. So if you're on ECR, and on other cloud providers at the same time, it makes sense to push your images to a central place and then from there distribute into the registries of the cloud provider of your choice. Because then you can use the given functionality of the cloud provider, because it's then normally it's nicely integrated into the Kubernetes cluster there. And on the other hand, you have one place where you push images and the other place where this images appears, and it's very handy and nice for the developers to work with them. So one use case is which I call called everything in one place, and it's basically some sort of an additional security layer that you implement, and it goes like this. So you have a Harbor instance or a cluster within your organization or within the cloud provider of your organization, and you basically restrict access to every other container registry, and everything has to go over your container registry. So this means like you proxying every other container registry, and this way you on one hand you can of course do it very restrictive. You can say, okay, only if I approve this, you can pull this. This is one very restrictive way of doing things, and I'm not a big fan of this kind of restriction. But there is another option that can say, okay, you can give the responsibility to developer and say you can pull whatever you want, but you have to do it over our registry. So your registry is acting as a pull-through cache or as a proxy. And then as an operator or as an organization, you have the advantage that you have the visibility about who is pulling what and you can also scan those images. So you have a really good control then, and knowing what are the developers, what containers are the developers using, without restricting them, and also without forcing them to do things that are not very practical. So it gets, and then you can of course run vulnerability scans over it, and then if you see that something is off and it's not correct and should be corrected, you can still apply policies, or you can call the responsible developers and talk to them, or deny access until he can prove that this is needed, for example. So that's really nice and good to provide the organization with a good visibility over container usage within the whole organization. And this way you can make sure that you have a really good control and monitor what is actually used inside your organization, what containers are used inside your organizations. The other point, which is specific a bit to Harbor, but I think it's also with the cloud providers. It's also something that they provide, is the deep Kubernetes integration. So you could set up your container registry with a deep integration to Kubernetes, and every time someone, or you grant access to someone to a namespace, and he creates a namespace, he automatically gets a project within Harbor, and this project automatically gets in the robot account, and the robot account gets the pool secrets, and the pool secrets are automatically injected into the Kubernetes cluster, so that when you deploy a container or make a deployment, you don't have to provide any pool secrets, and the pool secrets automatically rotated every week or so that things are fully automated, and the user doesn't have to care about coping around pool secrets and image secrets and things like this, because everything is nicely integrated and automated, and you can go even further and kind of a synchronized project and namespace creation. So whenever you do on one side, it's automatically reflected on the other side, and this makes for the developer really easy to interact with your Kubernetes cluster, and also with your container registry, because it's native, and he doesn't have to care about any secrets, and he just uses the right image schema or image naming convention, and he automatically can get images from Docker Hub. So you can combine this, of course, with the proxy. The other point that I also see quite a lot in the reason why people are adopting Harbor is basically from the software perspective, is the way how to distribute container images. So basically, companies are using Harbor to distribute their software to as a container image. So it's mostly independent software vendors that distribute their software as container images instead of zip files and binaries. So, and because when you talk about the classical distribution of software, you just upload somewhere a zip file or an setup file and let the user download it and install and use it. This is of course not the case for container workflows, because in a container workflow you don't want to tar your container and then ship it to the customer and say now check in into your registry. You would like to be a good software vendor, and you want to provide your customer with direct access to their newest image, so that he can automatically pull this the image from your registry directly into his cluster and use your software. And this is something that I see quite often, that the companies are adopting Harbor to accomplish this. So they integrate Harbor into their workflow, into their software distribution channels, and provide their customers, partners with credentials and access to Harbor, so they can consume and use their software as a container image. This is something that it's very difficult to accomplish with the container registries that are provided by AWS or Azure, and even Docker Hub is also a bit difficult to accomplish this. There's another point. It's called the self-container images. There's even the possibility that you could kind of sell container images. So you can tie this whole process with a subscription and payment system, so that when someone pays or the subscription is is activated, he gets automatically credentials for the image, and then during the subscription period, he can then pull and push, or not push, but pull images, and so he can use this as a so basically to sell images. The other point that I've seen also a few times is that software vendors specifically would like to see who is using their containers. So they want to have a visibility about who is using their containers. So the other are using the registry for basically for analytics purposes. So they want to see are our customers using our newest image, our newest software, and whom of our customers are using our old, outdated stack, so that we can approach them directly and ask them, look, why are you using our software? Can we help you update? Because we don't want to maintain it, for example. So there is a possibility to have a visibility on how your customers are using your software. So you don't have to instrument your software. Provide kind of analytics into your software, because sometimes the software cannot go connect outside. But if customers are pulling your images, you can see who is pulling your images, and then you can know that this customer is still using the old version, and you should maybe approach him and ask him to update or help them to update. And I've seen even customers that adopting this functionality to send out demos. So they send out logins to potential customers, and if they see that the potential customer is pulling these images, they immediately can call the customer and say, look, apparently you want to use our software. We are happy to hear that. Can we help you? And then they can immediately engage with the customer even before he starts deploying or something, or even before he really starts using the software, which is in my opinion, an advantage or a step ahead. There is even the option to use this OCI Registry as a storage functionality. So there's a project called ORAS, and you can basically push any type of artifact to an OCI compliant container registry. So you can upload text file. So it's basically it becomes like a bucket. So you can upload any things, and people are using it for TensorFlow data models. So they're using container images a lot for storing sample data or data that's easy to distribute, because if you can pull a container, you can get some stuff into the container so that you can reuse it. So it's really handy if you're working with static data to push this into a container and use it as such. And ORAS is such a project. So thank you everyone for staying with me today. My last topic is this unpopular opinion, and so I challenge to say that most companies that build software don't need artifact repository at all. Maybe they need a container registry if they're fully on containers, but for most companies today, they don't really need an artifact repository, because the trend goes towards Git as a source of truth. We want to have everything as a source of truth. We have pipelines that can automatically build this specific software based on this hash and automatically deploy it. So there is not need to store some artifacts in third place, because we can always rebuild things. There is of course the trend towards GitOps. It's built on Git, so that we want to have a automated deployment based directly from our repository, and then the other side is just pulling your code and building it and deploying it. So there is also no place for an artifact repository. And this is the same for platform as a service providers, because they all go into this GitOps flow, so that you automatically provide just a link to your code, and then everything else is more or less happening automatically. So the only reason to have an artifact repository, in my opinion, is if you want to internally distribute and reshare libraries. So this is kind of my take on this, and I'm happy to discuss this opinion with you and see how far we can push this. Thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch with me, I will be at the bar afterwards. Also, you can write me an email. You can also contact me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and all other social medias that you're aware of. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vadim, for this interesting presentation about Project Harbor. It's really nice to see things like security scanning and analytics and other features integrated into the container registry. That's a really cool thing. And how many external contributors do you get?
To Project Harbor?
Mm-hmm.
So as of today, there are 255 contributors in total, so over the last 5 years. And normally it's mostly the most contributors that are there are basically the ones who are fixing bugs and finding things that don't work for them, and they're providing solutions. So these are the most contributors, and the general direction is kind of provided by VMware.
Mm-hmm. And how did you came across Harbor yourself?
How did I came across Harbor myself? I've been into this space for I think like 5 years already, and it started on a customer project where we had to deploy containers, and they wanted to be on-prem, and there was no container registry except Docker registry, and we've been using SUSE or Portus container registry. And from there, it kind of evolved. And since last year, we switched from Portus to Harbor, and we're very happy with that.
Cool. Okay. I think that's about it with the question. Thank you again for being here, Vadim.